The design of the first five-year plan was by a corporation probably not known to most Americans, Albert Kahn. But Albert Kahn was the foremost industrial architect in the United States. And Albert Kahn laid out the basics of the first five-year plan for the Soviets. And then we find, again, the same corporations involved with the construction of the plants. International General Electric, most certainly, DuPont, Ford Motor, Hercules Motor, Curtiss-Wright in aircraft engines, and even some corporations which today were forgotten about, like Vultee and Chance Vought. These were aircraft manufacturers at that time. And so American corporations came in and they built the first five-year plan. But what was important, the Soviets then copied these plans, and this accounts for the tremendous Russian output. They took this initial equipment and they multiplied it, they copied it by the hundred.
Now, how about Ford Motor Company? Did they play a part in the building up of the Soviet potential?
Very definitely. Ford Motor Company built the Gorky plant, and the Gorky plant produces the GAZ series of vehicles, that's G-A-Z, and these are trucks, and there's some automobiles. And right from the early 1930s, you find that the GAZ plant has had military potential. And Ford was decimated, as of course many other cities in Germany were decimated, but somewhere along the line, something happened. I suspect it was in the aiming committees, and without question orders were sent out not to bomb certain targets, even though these were prime military targets.
And that's rather reminiscent of some of the orders that went out during the Korean War, some of the orders that went out during the Vietnamese War to leave specific targets within the enemy's domain untouched by our strategic bombing.
I understand that was so, although I've not investigated it.
Now, in your book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, there was one very interesting section about a special fund that Heinrich Himmler had, and the funneling of money from German corporations into this fund, even up into the years 1943 and 1944. And many of these corporations had strong ties into the American corporations, into the American parent corporations. Could you tell us a little bit about the Kepler Fund?
The Kepler Fund was also known as the Konto S Fund. It was what we might call Heinrich Himmler's personal slush fund. He used it for his own personal projects. And what amazed me was both in 1933 and in 1944, the 2 years for which I examined the records, over half the funds came from American corporations. For example, in 1933, the 2 years for which I examined the records, over half the funds came from American corporations. For example, in 1933, ITT, Standard Oil, General Electric, and possibly Osram were contributors. Even in 1944, in the middle of World War II, we find that ITT was funneling funds to Heinrich Himmler's fund through Schroeder, who was the chairman of the ITT subsidiaries in Germany. We also find that Depag, the Standard Oil subsidiary in Germany, was financing Heinrich Himmler, and this was in the middle of World War II.
Now, were these facts ever brought out at the Nuremberg hearings?
They were never brought out at the Nuremberg hearings, although the documents do exist within the files, within the records. They have not been published, as far as I know.
And you actually had access to these records?
Yes, there's some 400 tons of these records available, and many of them were at the Hoover Institution, or copies were at the Hoover Institution, and that's where I found the original documentation.
I think it's a tragic part of our history when the American public doesn't realize the interplay then between great American corporations and the financing, the funding of the Nazi movement. Now, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the Nuremberg trials, because at the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis
tied in with Chase Manhattan Bank. He's on the International Advisory Committee of Chase Manhattan. What caught my attention was that Fiat does not manufacture automobile manufacturing equipment. All the Fiat plants in Italy contain American equipment. And what I found was that the equipment was coming, perhaps about 60–70% of it, from the United States, from major automobile equipment suppliers in the United States. I think it was known as the Fiat plant as a cover to perhaps divert attention from the fact that during the Vietnamese War, we were building the largest plant in the world. It covers 36 square miles. We were building for the Soviets, with American equipment, the largest plant in the world. And so it was called the Italian Fiat plant, and I think this was a blind.
And so they were building their trucks and armored personnel carriers and other things that could be used then for warfare in South Vietnam?
We knew that the Karma plant had military potential. In 1972, I wrote it in National Suicide. I said as much in Miami Beach in 1972. This plant has military potential. It can produce military vehicles. We knew it. And of course today in Afghanistan, we find that the Karma vehicles that are there in Afghanistan today from the Karma plant built by American and Italian companies.
And it was after you brought out this information that efforts were made to suppress your book, National Suicide,
Yes.
and your other studies?
Yes, because I was bringing out, laid out the basics of the first 5-year plan for the Soviets. And then we find, again, the same corporations involved with the construction of the plants. International General Electric, most certainly, DuPont, Ford Motor, Hercules Motor, Curtiss-Wright in aircraft engines, and even some corporations which today we've forgotten about, like Vultee and Chance Vought. These were aircraft manufacturers at that time. And so American corporations came in and they built the first 5-year plan. But what was important, the Soviets then copied these plans, and this accounts for the tremendous Russian output. They took this initial equipment and they multiplied it, they copied it by the 100.
Now, how about Ford Motor Company? Did they play a part in the building up of the Soviet potential?
Very definitely. Ford Motor Company built the Gorky plant, and the Gorky plant produces the GAZ series of vehicles, that's G-A-Z, and these are trucks, and there's some automobiles. And right from the early 1930s, you find that the GAZ plant has had military potential, and Ford knew that when it went in and built the Gorky plant. And we know it because I found statements to this effect within the State Department files.
Sometimes we hear the name Averell Harriman. Did he play a part in building up the Soviet technology?
Very definitely. In fact, Averell Harriman came out of the Soviet Union of 1913 figures, and people were starving by the hundreds of thousands. And the Hoover mission was organized, of course, to send aid to Russia. But most of the aid went to the Bolsheviks, who controlled really quite a small part of Russia at that time. Only a very small part of the aid went to the White Russians or to the Far East.
And then after 1922, 1923, Lenin instituted something known as the New Economic Policy, or this series of 5-year plans. Can you tell us about the 5-year plans and the part that the major American corporations, major world corporations played in building up the Soviet Union?
Well, there are two separate phases here. The new economic policy was started in 1923 by Lenin, and I found, and I published this in my first book from Stanford, that every single Russian industry was rebuilt or restarted by foreign corporations, mostly German, British, French, and American. By 1928, Russia was back to approximately its 1913 industrial output. And at that point, she began to think of these grandiose 5-year plans. And in 1928, Gosplan, which is the Russian government planning commission, actually designed an initial 5-year.
You talked about the bombing patterns during the Second World War, and the fact that it was amazing that there were certain factories that were not bombed, whereas the majority of the German factories were decimated, German-owned factories. There were certain factories that tied into this interlock we've already alluded to, that for some strange reason seemed to escape the devastation of our saturation bombing.
In World War II, the German electrical industry was, or should have been, a prime target for Western bombing. But in practice, the German General Electric plants were not bombed. Of the 10 major plants, not one was bombed, and a half a dozen others had trifling damage, broken windows, that kind of thing. So what we have here is a very interesting case of an industry which should have been bombed in World War II, but was not bombed, and yet we have American ownership, which raises a certain amount of suspicion as to why it was not bombed.
But as far as the German-owned electrical companies, did they undergo a rather heavy bombing?
I took a look at that. The Siemens plant, for example, they were bombed. There's no question. But the industry was not targeted as a general target. So Siemens, for example, was not bombed as heavily as, say, tank plants or aviation plants, that kind of thing.
You mentioned the Ford plant in Cologne. Was this a prime military